A phone call, not a summit, not a formal diplomatic engagement with press releases and prepared statements, and the careful choreography that governments use when they want the world to know that something significant is happening. A private phone call between Donald Trump and Giorgia Meloni, and when word of what was discussed leaked into the corridors of Brussels, senior European officials went quiet with the specific quality of silence that does not follow good news. It follows fear. Because what is being constructed through this channel between Washington and Rome is not a bilateral friendship between two ideologically aligned leaders who happen to get along. It is a new architecture of Western power being assembled piece by piece outside the institutional framework that the European Union was built to be. A framework that could bypass Brussels entirely, that could determine which European nations survive America's economic pressure and which ones get crushed by it, and that has already produced agreements of civilizational significance that most European leaders were not consulted about before they were signed. Italy was not supposed to be this powerful. It spends less on defense than almost any other NATO member. Its economy has been carrying a debt burden that Brussels has been trying to manage for years. And yet, as of early 2026, Giorgia Meloni is the only European leader that the most powerful man in the world will pick up the phone for. The question that nobody in Brussels can answer, and that is keeping the most senior people in European institutions awake at night, is the one that changes everything once you ask it seriously. If Meloni is the only European leader Trump will actually listen to, then who is actually running Europe? To understand why a single phone call between Rome and Washington produced the specific quality of alarm that it produced inside European institutions, you have to understand how extraordinary the relationship between Donald Trump and Giorgia Meloni actually is in the context of how Trump has conducted his diplomacy with European leaders since returning to power. Trump has publicly humiliated the leaders of France and Germany. He has threatened trade wars against countries that have been American allies for 70 years. He has mocked the British Prime Minister in terms that no previous American president would have deployed toward a head of government of the United Kingdom, regardless of their political differences. The pattern of his European diplomacy has been consistent and deliberate. He treats European leaders as representatives of an institutional arrangement he considers extractive, and as politicians whose domestic weakness makes them unsuitable partners for the kind of transactional dealing he respects. Into this landscape, the relationship between Trump and Meloni stands as something so different in its character and its implications that European governments have been struggling since it became visible to find an analytical framework adequate to what they are observing. He treats her as an equal. In the brutal zero-sum arithmetic of Trump's diplomatic world, that distinction is worth more than any treaty ever written because it translates directly into the access and influence and leverage that determine whose interests get protected when the decisions that matter are being made. The relationship did not begin in the formal diplomatic setting of a Washington summit. It began in Paris at the reopening ceremony of Notre Dame Cathedral in late 2024, a setting whose symbolic weight, grand and historic and saturated with Western civilizational significance, turned out to be the perfect backdrop for the beginning of one of the most consequential political partnerships of the current era. Trump walked away from that first encounter with a verdict that he delivered publicly and that people who understand how he operates recognized immediately as something more significant than a diplomatic pleasantry. He described her as a real live wire. He said she was great. In Trump's political vocabulary, those are not throwaway compliments deployed to manage a diplomatic relationship. They are signals of genuine regard that, in his world, translate directly into the currency of access. What followed that Paris encounter stunned European capitals in a sequence whose cumulative significance was impossible to dismiss as coincidence or protocol. When Trump won the presidential election and prepared for his January 2025 inauguration, he extended invitations to a select group of world leaders. The leaders of France, Germany, and Britain were not among them. Giorgia Meloni was the only European leader who received an invitation to that inauguration, and she accepted it. She sat in the rotunda of the United States Capitol on that historic day, surrounded by Trump's inner circle, while the leaders of the continent's largest economies watched from their home capitals on television screens. The symbolism required no interpretation. In Washington's new power hierarchy, Italy had been placed above Germany, above France, above Britain. Every foreign ministry in Europe registered what that placement meant, and not one of them had a prepared response to it because nothing in the post-war architecture of European-American relations had produced a precedent for what they were now observing. The relationship deepened further in the months that followed, and what made it genuinely dangerous from the perspective of European institutional solidarity was not simply the warmth between the two leaders. It was the timing. Trump did not befriend Meloni during a period of transatlantic calm. He befriended her precisely as he was preparing to unleash the most aggressive economic pressure against European countries that any American administration had deployed in the modern era. When Trump announced sweeping tariffs in early April 2025, a blanket 20% levy on all European exports to the United States, the European Union was thrown into the kind of controlled panic that its institutional architecture is particularly poorly equipped to manage because it requires the simultaneous coordination of 27 governments whose economic exposures and domestic political constraints vary so significantly that finding a unified response within the time frame that the crisis demanded was close to institutionally impossible. Ursula von der Leyen, as president of the European Commission, was technically the most powerful trade negotiator in Europe by virtue of the treaty architecture that gives the Commission exclusive authority over EU trade policy. She sent multiple requests to the White House for a direct meeting with Trump to address the tariff situation. Every single one of those requests was denied. Meloni picked up the phone. Within days, she had secured what the official leader of European trade negotiations could not obtain through every formal channel available to her: a direct meeting at the White House with the President of the United States. The contrast was not lost on anyone watching European politics with serious attention. The institutional architecture of the EU's trade authority, built across decades of treaty negotiation and designed to give Europe the collective weight to deal with major powers from a position of equivalence, had produced a commission president who could not get into the room. The Italian prime minister walked through the front door. Meloni's own advisors described the visit in terms that captured the extraordinary nature of what was occurring, calling it a high-stakes commercial peace mission. The entire European Union, which had given her no formal mandate to negotiate anything on its behalf and whose treaty architecture explicitly reserved trade negotiating authority for the Commission, quietly held its breath and hoped she could produce a result that its own institutional mechanisms had been unable to generate. When the meeting happened, the world watched with the attention that moments of genuine geopolitical significance command. Trump greeted Meloni with the public warmth that he reserves for the small number of world leaders he considers genuine partners rather than institutional interlocutors to be managed. He described her as fantastic and as one of the real leaders of the world, a phrase whose significance in Trump's political vocabulary was not lost on the European governments watching the exchange with growing anxiety about its implications. Meloni delivered the line that instantly became the defining statement of the encounter. Standing beside Trump, she looked into the cameras and said that her goal was to make the West great again. The deliberate echo of Trump's own signature political language was not accidental, and it was not subtle. It was a precisely crafted signal to Trump and to every European leader watching simultaneously. She and Trump were operating from the same ideological foundation. She was not in Washington as a supplicant seeking relief from economic pressure that her country's vulnerability had made difficult to resist. She was there as a partner whose shared vision gave the partnership a substance that purely transactional relationships lack. The shockwaves that followed moved through European political circles with the speed and the range that only genuine strategic surprises produce. Comfortable analytical frameworks were suddenly insufficient. Several EU chancelleries began articulating concerns that had been present but unspoken since the Trump-Meloni relationship had first become visible. The fear that Italy's special position in Washington could function as a channel through which American pressure reached individual European governments directly, bypassing the collective institutional defenses that the EU's unified trade policy was supposed to provide, was no longer a hypothetical worth noting in an analytical footnote. It was an operational concern with concrete implications for how the EU's negotiating position on tariffs and trade could be maintained against an American administration that had demonstrated both the will and the capacity to deal with European governments individually when dealing with them, collectively produced results it did not want The economic dimension of what was being constructed through the Rome-Washington channel became considerably clearer when the details of what Trump and Meloni had actually discussed and agreed began emerging through the multiple sources that serious diplomatic information always eventually finds, regardless of the confidentiality intentions of the parties involved. The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor was the agreement whose significance had received the least public attention relative to its actual geopolitical weight and whose implications for Italy's position in the emerging architecture of Western economic power were the most transformative of anything that had been signed or announced through the Rome-Washington relationship. The corridor was designed with an ambition whose scale made it one of the most significant infrastructure and connectivity projects discussed at the level of major power diplomacy in the current era. It would link India to the Gulf states, move from the Gulf through the Middle East and into Europe, and connect from Europe directly into the United States, creating a continuous economic corridor that would provide an alternative to the Chinese-led connectivity infrastructure that had been expanding across the same geographic space for years. The critical detail that transformed Italy's geopolitical position in ways that no previous bilateral relationship with Washington had produced was the identification of the Italian port of Trieste as the primary European gateway for the entire network. Italy was not simply participating in the corridor as one of several European entry points whose relative importance would be determined by commercial and logistical factors over time. Italy was the hinge, the physical point where the Indo-Pacific economy met the European economy, the node through which the commercial and strategic flows of the entire corridor's European dimension would pass. That designation was not a trade arrangement whose benefits were measurable in terms of port revenues and logistics employment and the incremental economic activity that major infrastructure investments generate in their immediate geographic area. It was a structural repositioning of Italy's place in the architecture of global commerce and global power, whose implications extended far beyond economics into the strategic domain where the decisions that determine the long-term trajectory of nations are actually made. And it had been agreed in a private White House meeting that the leaders of France, Germany, Spain, and every other major European economy had not been part of and had not been consulted about before the agreement was reached and announced. The security dimension of what was being discussed through the Rome-Washington channel was even more sensitive than the economic architecture and had received even less public attention because the parties involved had stronger reasons to manage its visibility carefully. The Mediterranean had been the geographic focus of the security conversations between Trump and Meloni in ways whose strategic logic was immediately apparent to anyone who understood the intersection of geography, energy, migration, and military positioning that made control of that body of water one of the most consequential factors in European and Middle Eastern security simultaneously. The Mediterranean was not simply a sea connecting the southern edge of Europe to the northern edge of Africa. It was the corridor through which energy supplies moved from North African and Middle Eastern production points into the European economies that depended on them. It was the route through which migration flows from the African continent reached the Italian, French, and Spanish coastlines that had been the defining political issue of European domestic politics for a decade. It was the theater in which any future conflict involving North Africa, the Middle East, or the increasingly unstable Sahel region would play out with direct and immediate consequences for European security. And whoever held a privileged position in the management of Mediterranean security held leverage over an enormous share of the factors determining European stability that no institutional arrangement centered on Brussels could replicate or override. Italy's geographic position in the Mediterranean was not an advantage that diplomacy or economic investment had created. It was a structural fact of geography that placed the Italian peninsula and its island territories at the physical center of the sea, whose management the security conversations between Rome and Washington were addressing. Italy's existing military relationships with governments across North Africa, developed across years of engagement, driven partly by energy interests and partly by the migration management imperative that had been the defining domestic political pressure on every Italian government for a decade, gave Rome the access and the credibility with Tunisian, Libyan, and Egyptian governments that Washington needed, but could not generate directly through the kind of bilateral relationships that American diplomacy in the region had historically produced. A security arrangement that formalized Italy's role as the southern anchor of American strategic interests in the Mediterranean, even if structured informally to avoid the institutional complications that a formal treaty would generate, would mean that a function currently performed by the entire NATO alliance operating collectively would be quietly redistributed toward a bilateral arrangement between Rome and Washington, whose terms were set by the two parties involved rather than by the alliance consensus process that NATO's decision-making required. The implications for European defense coordination and for the EU's ambition to develop an independent security identity that could operate without American dependence were profound in ways that Brussels had not yet fully articulated publicly, because doing so would require acknowledging the extent to which the architecture being assembled through the Rome-Washington channel was already operating outside the institutional frameworks that European security planning assumed would govern these questions. Ukraine was the third dimension of the Rome-Washington relationship, whose significance for European unity was the most immediately consequential because it was playing out in real time against the backdrop of the most serious security crisis on the European continent since the Second World War. Meloni's position on Ukraine had been, from the beginning of her government, one of the most carefully calibrated political balancing acts in recent European history. She had maintained consistent public support for Ukrainian sovereignty and had kept Italy's formal commitment to the collective European position on the war intact against the domestic political pressure from coalition partners whose instincts were more accommodating toward Russian interests. But she had simultaneously refused to endorse the escalatory posture that some European governments had been pushing, and had kept open the channel to Washington that her relationship with Trump provided, even as that channel became more politically complicated to maintain as Trump's second term produced positions on Ukraine that diverged sharply from the European consensus. When Trump unveiled his peace proposal for Ukraine, a proposal that European governments had not been consulted about before it was publicly announced, and whose terms departed from the principles of territorial integrity and robust security guarantees that the European position had been built around, Meloni's response was the one that produced the most significant reaction in European diplomatic circles. She did not denounce it. She did not join the collective European expression of concern about a peace process being conducted without adequate European participation. She and the Finnish president jointly called Trump to discuss the proposal directly, and Meloni told journalists afterward that the discussions were at a very delicate stage, that Europe needed to be part of the process, and that it made more sense to engage with the existing American proposal than to construct a European counterproposal that would compete with it. In the precise vocabulary of diplomatic communication, that statement carried weight, far exceeding its apparently measured tone. It meant that Italy, a founding member of the European Union and a core NATO ally, had publicly endorsed the American framework for ending the war in Ukraine as the appropriate starting point for negotiations, rather than the